thank you all of you for joining us on this event. This is the discussion that's named Institution for Possible Futures, the collection as a resistance. Maybe a bit of a provocative name, but I thought that maybe it can trigger some discussion between us. So I'm so happy that this discussion is made in the frames of the 70th Jubilee of this institution, National Gallery of Macedonia. And as I said, this discussion basically is a continuation of a project that I started last year. And it was a two-part discussion of the importance of the collection of this institution, not only how it is displayed and presented, but also what it means for a national gallery to have a collection in this moment, but also how it's presented for the importance in the future times. With us tonight are two important people for me. One of them is Charles Sash, and the other one is Albert Heta. I'm just gonna write their short bios and their presentations, and then we're gonna move on. So Charles Sash is director of Van Abbe Museum Eindhoven, professor of contemporary art and a curator in Central St. Martin's, London, and co-director of After All Journal and Books. He teaches on exhibition studies MR's course at CSM and at Jan van Eyck Academy, Maastricht. Out with the museum, he co-curated Lost Museum Kunsthalle Oslo 2017 and Musée Égaré Printemps de Septembre, Toulouse 2016, Jakarta Biennial 2015, 31st Sao Paulo Biennial 2014, U3 Triennial Ljubljana 2011, Rebek Biennial Palestine 2007 and 2009, Istanbul Biennial 2005, Guangzhou Biennial 2002, amongst other international exhibitions. He is also a chair of Casco Utrecht, and he received 2012 Princess Margaret Award and the 2014 CCS Bard College Prize for Curatorial Excellence. This is a really important biography, and thank you for being with us tonight. In the frames of this discussion, Charles Sash will talk about the modern possibility, or the artistic and museum activities that seek to contribute to social change. Society and culture seem to be at the transition point at the modern, postmodern, ultra-modern explanation of the world no longer holds. The question is how to embrace a different way of seeing and thinking. The talk will suggest how we can begin to answer to that challenge, which I think this question is really important also in the present-day Macedonia. And on my right side is Albert Heta, and Albert, you've been quite for many times here as well, and also part of our ACTA festival in Bitola and in Skopje, but in this constellation, maybe in the National Gallery is your first time, I think? Yes. So maybe you know him, but also I'm going to read your biography. So he's an artist, curator, designer, and social critic based in Pristina. His works in contemporary art are often simple acts of intervention in existing social condition, responses to a given situation, or a thinking of existing objects. His notable works is It's Too Time to Go Visiting, No Visa Required, a public intervention on British Airways billboards in Pristina 2003, Embassy of the Republic of Kosovo in Cetinje 2004 for the Cetinje Biennial, curated by Irene Blok and Natasha Ilic, and his Kosovar Pavilion Venice Biennial 2005, distributed in collaboration with eFlux, and not merely the installations or acts of appropriation, but also acts of engagement and relations with the conditions under which the works were accepted by the curators, media, politicians, and the public. Since 2006, his work is also channeled through a collaborative intervention project institution, Station Center for Contemporary Art Pristina. In 2015, Station initiated Summer School as a School, a collaborative interdisciplinary art and educational platform, originally inspired by the case of Kosovo, where education system was structured in the mid-50s. Summer School as a School is designed to unite and disseminate critical knowledge and address relevant challenges of today, implementing new models and possibilities in art education and artistic collaboration. Albert Heta, on this occasion, will present the project Back to the Future, a project which was not supposed to happen. Since its beginning in 2009, Back to the Future was shaped within the program of the exhibitions such as Petrit Halilei, Back to the Future in 2009 and 2010, Back to the Future Agim Kavdarbasha, 2010 to 2010, Back to the Future Nusret Saliha Midjici in 2010, and Back to the Future Kader Pagarusha in 2010. The next stage of the project was the symposium Back to the Future in 2011 and the panel discussion with Zdenka Badovinac, Mehmet Beluli, and Shukri Nimani. The director's cut, Recep Ferry, is the exhibition that is not supposed to happen as part of the project Back to the Future, a curatorial project by Albert Heta produced for Station Center for Contemporary Art Pristina. Looking in the past of this project, Back to the Future as a project in the international scene also had a close encounter with a larger object, Artissima Art Fair in 2010. The section Back to the Future for this event was conceived by a scientific committee consisting of 3 curators of museum collections: Christine Marcel, curator at Centre Pompidou, Paris; Jessica Morgan, curator Contemporary Art Tate Modern, London; and Massimiliano Gioni, director of special projects, New Museum of Contemporary Art, New York, and artistic director, Fondazione Nicola Trussardi, Milan. This section was created not only with the same name, but also incredible similarities with the project in Pristina that are more than only interesting to work with in the future. Back to the Future with Recep Ferry and Jevdet Jafar were parts of the initial structure of Back to the Future as a project. Both were cancelled in the late research phase of the project in mid-2010. The process of researching the work of Recep Ferry, which is born in 1937, had reached the final phase and projected the final meeting point, reaching the working communication with his great artist and complex personality. Recep Ferry is a painter, poet, and writer, but above all, he is a thinker. So, in this particular moment, when we celebrate the issue, we'll celebrate the jubilee of the oldest institution for visual arts in the country, the National Gallery of Macedonia, I would like to open 2 questions. One of them is, if we acknowledge, hypothetically, that we live in institutionalized modernism in the country, that is, the local modernist project, projected by institutional functioning, hasn't finished, where do we start, or where do we focus in order to move forward or in different direction? And the second question of this discussion is, how one collection, small but resilient, that this institution possesses, can open possible ruptures in this institutionalized modernist situation. Without further ado, I would give the floor to Charles and Albert to talk about their projects, and also after that we're going to have a Q&A session, so you can all pose questions, give comments, and also express different ideas. And the end of this prologue, I would also like to thank the National Gallery of Macedonia, the city of Skopje, and also the organization Faculty of Things That Can Be Learned. And I would also like to announce the exhibition, the curated group exhibition next year, that started already with its research phase this year. And for that, we had the assistant of the Museum of American Art in Berlin present in Macedonia. He's going to present his work as the rest of the works in the next year's exhibition in June. So that's for my part. For this big prologue, I'm going to give the floor to Charles.
Firstly, thank you very much to Ivana for inviting me here, and it's very nice to do it in front of our ambassador to Macedonia from the Netherlands. And also thanks to all of you for coming. I think we have about 20 minutes to 30 minutes or so to talk. The story that I usually tell is a bit longer than that, so I'm going to try and make a shortened version of it. And what I thought is interesting in this city particularly, which I've just seen, this is my first time in Skopje, and I suppose I was very conscious when I started seeing the monuments and started responding to it, that I suppose 2 things that related to what you were saying and related to this legacy of both modernism and modernity, and I would pull those 2 words apart. Modernity for me is a much longer trajectory, a trajectory that maybe begins with the colonial adventures in 1492, so essentially with the beginning of Columbus. And modernism is something which begins possibly with the revolutions that were not successful, like many revolutions, in 1848 in Europe, and obviously the whole question of the end of the Ottoman Empire is very much tied to those movements in terms of the emancipatory notion of the nation state, and how that actually became a liberal and then later became a more ambiguous idea of belonging and of identity. So we have modernism and we have modernity in socio-political and to some extent economic terms, but we also have modernity and modernism in relationship to culture, to the visual expressions of those socio-economic political events and phenomena. And I think we always need to unpick those things because it's not easy. Sometimes we get lost, also in regular English, but I think also in many other languages, modern can also mean just what's happening today, and it can be modern. and without seemingly any ideological loading into that term. But in fact, of course, the way that modern comes from is as loaded as any other ideological position. What I was thinking when coming here, the first thoughts are that what I saw here in Skopje was an incredibly contemporary, which is another word that sort of counters the modern, a moment of incredible presence in a certain way. And I thought, well, how is it possible that these monuments, this sort of reflection of a past, which feels to be related to some extent to issues of fake news, a mythology which has little relationship to factual archaeological finds and things like that, but nevertheless is sustainable, apparently sustainable to the extent that these monuments physically exist. To what extent is that a reflection of the modernity that went before, or let's call it the modernism that went before? In other words, the fact that Skopje was rebuilt after the earthquake in the 1960s, from late 1950s onwards, is that what allows this step of Skopje 2014 to happen? Is it the existence of the particular history of this city which allows this new city, in a sense, or at least this new centre, to emerge? Yeah? And how is the relationship between this idea of a modernism, let's call it a modernism at the moment, but also related to modernity, which always projects itself into the future? Yeah? It's always something which is to come. Modernity is always to come. We sacrifice ourselves, whether it's a communist ideology or to some extent a capitalist ideology, we sacrifice ourselves in the present in order to produce a society which is to come. If you think about Soviet modernism, it is built for the new human who will emerge as a result of communism. It's not built for the current human. Liszewski's designs are not meant to be built here. Corbusier's architecture is not meant for the current society. It's meant for a society which will emerge and will fit to the designs that modernism had. And so this sort of suspension of time, in a way, suspension of the present, then creates maybe two interesting aspects, one of which is, what do you do with that history of an ideology, modernism, when it has run its course? And that's a question that we have in modern art museums. Like, what on earth do we do with this modernity which is no longer modern, in the sense that it's no longer contemporary, it's no longer of the moment? And the other thing is, what permissions or what possibilities does that legacy of modernism open up for us? And maybe, and as I say, it's a very initial reflection of the situation in Skopje, but maybe the very modernism of this city allowed something to happen which would have been much more difficult to do in Belgrade. I can't imagine that the Kalemegdan would have been simply removed. There would have been much more resistance to that. Yeah, a different sense of longevity. But modernism in itself feels then much more precarious, much more fragile, much more able to be dismissed, not necessarily only because of its age, but also because it's the ideology of always being directed towards a future which will never arrive. So therefore it seems quite reasonable to remove it if that future hasn't arrived, when we arrive at the future, which in a sense we are. So that's why I think that it feels very present, because it feels like we're arriving at that point in that shift from the modern city to the city that we have now, the contemporary city here, which relates to this idea of a modernism that has not only failed but has allowed its failure to be addressed through this new architecture. So I find it quite fascinating to be here. Now, that's to some extent beside the point, but I suppose it's related to a lot of things that I would like to talk about. What I'm going to talk about is the first point that I made there, which is, what do we do with this modern legacy? And in the Netherlands, of course, we have a huge modern archive. And the Netherlands is one of the most modern countries in Europe, in a certain sense, which also maybe today means that it's quite old-fashioned, because it's still trying to maintain certain ideas of the modern in its own structure. And it has, of course, sufficient wealth in a way to still try and maintain those. But actually the energy of the creation of the modern ideology of a country like the Netherlands, a country born in 1848 to some extent, its current boundaries existing since 1830, and its state largely emerging in the second half of the 19th century, that modern country is now struggling to figure out what it might mean in the present, when in a sense the buttons and the levers that used to be able to be pulled in order to maintain the position no longer work. You pull them, but the train doesn't stop. You pull them, but society doesn't change in the ways that government or even capital expects society to do. It reacts in a different way. Yeah? Our old instincts as a society are no longer apply when you press the same triggers. Now, one of the fundamental things about a museum, and you were saying, what does a museum do, or what can a museum do? A museum is essentially a storytelling machine, which quite often becomes a history-telling machine. But essentially, it's more about a narrative. It's more about telling a story. There are certainly some fundamental aspects of preserving the collection and allowing those stories to be retold. But essentially, when we look around the walls here, we're trying to figure out not necessarily the artistic quality of these works, but what are they in their juxtaposition, in their relationship one to another, and in their relationship in one room and another room. What story are they trying to tell? What story are they telling about this place, about Macedonia, about this region, about Europe, about the world, on all these different levels? And every museum, in a sense, inherits this idea of what story we are going to tell. And I think that for us in the Van Abbe Museum, and I'll try and address this in a minute with a couple of slides, the big question that we've had is a collection which starts with a Picasso painting from 1909, so very much sort of rooted in a classical idea of modern art, with Picasso as to some extent at least one of the originary heroes of the idea of modernism and modern art. I think we can go further back and we might talk about Courbet, or we might talk about Matisse, or we might talk about Impressionism. For sure, there are predecessors, but Picasso is one of those fundamental figures that exists within the narrative that many institutions accept to some extent as a relatively truthful account of modernism. That Picasso is a significant figure is something that many books, many museums understand to be true. So our museum also understands that. So we have a Picasso from 1909, bought in the 1950s, so when that story was already created, in a sense, in order to fill in the gap that not having a Picasso in the Van Abbe Museum represented if it wanted to tell this modern story. So it was already thinking about how do you tell a story looking backwards and complete the story by having certain kinds of painting or certain kinds of sculpture which would allow you to tell that story of the development of modern art. And I think one of the things that happens with these stories is that they become, to some extent, mythological, or they become factual over time. So the repetition of those stories, like myths, the repetition of those proposals, those suggestions, which is no more than Picasso being an important artist is. It's a proposal, it's a suggestion. That becomes something which becomes reified to a certain extent. It becomes something which is fixed and solidified and becomes true. And many museums therefore start telling the story of their modern collections, incorporating Picasso. And when a museum doesn't have a Picasso, and I'm guessing a little bit, maybe don't have a Picasso here, then somehow they feel a little bit inadequate, in a certain sense. They feel like they're not actually able to carry the same offer of truth, offer of authority that a museum that does have a Picasso. And so you get a little bit stuck in either sort of hierarchies of these stories, in which you might have local versions of Picasso which kind of serve the Picasso, but essentially try to produce the same narrative. And this storytelling really comes from somebody that you're talking about, and that I want to quickly refer to, because it also crosses over a lot with the Museum of American Art Pristina, which exists in Station at the moment and is a sort of permanent installation. And we also have our permanent installation working with the Museum of American Art Berlin, which is a similar organization run by some of the same personnel. But we've made a collaboration with them to in a sense, try and go back to the roots of this story, and by going back to the roots of this story, maybe allow other narratives to be written. And the reason to go back to the roots, to be radical, if you like, that's where the origin of the idea of radicalism comes from, is not to necessarily prove the story again, though that might emerge, I suppose, but to open up an understanding that not only are there other options possible, but that perhaps our position in relationship to those roots is different from the position you might have adopted when those roots were being planted. That our relation to this creature, if you like, this tree that's growing, is different after all these years than it is when it was first planted. And we can't really recapture that idea of the first moment. And it's not to say that the tree should go back to being a little shrub. It's fine as a tree, but it's also maybe time to let the tree behind, to turn away from the tree, to not look at it so much. And our ways of doing that, our ways of taking distance from the modern story, which I think are necessary because of how we observe the world, and that's a longer part of the text that maybe we can come back to in the questions, but I won't bother with sort of justifying that at the moment so much. But if we imagine that this modernity, which starts in 1492, and this modernism, which starts in 1848, are both energies, energy sources, pulses, which are dying out, which no longer carry the same energy, and actually become quite, in a certain sense, decadent, degenerate, we could say, in a certain sense, are in decay. They still project something, but the power of that projection is becoming less and less. So how do we deal with these Picassos if their power becomes less and less? And one proposal that I'd have very simply, I think this is where the Museum of American Art Berlin or Pristina or other museums of American art very much connects to, is that we need to take a distance from that story and to understand it as something which is no longer valid for us. And to do that, the status of those works changes. Because when they were really modern, in other words, when they were of their time, they were still alive. And by being alive, it means that the people who were looking at them, the people that were standing in front of them, also understood themselves as being modern and understood themselves as being in the same time-space continuum as those paintings. We shared the context. And the we that I mean there is a very particular we. It's based on education, it's based on class, it's based on ethnicity, it's based on Western notions of civilization, it's based on NATO, it's based on United States post-war, it's based on very kind of specific ideas of who that we is. It's based on gender. But that we that stood in front of it, and you can imagine I'm picturing somebody very much like me, physically, in terms of who that we is. That we that stands in front of that painting has to be, in a sense, bringing the context of that painting with them. And therefore you can show it in a white cube, therefore you can show it in a classical modern presentation, because all the context that painting needs to be understood is inside me. Me particularly, I'm a super privileged viewer of that Picasso. But it's all inside me. But what happens when not only I change, but what's inside me is no longer valid to deal with the world as it's actually processed, to deal with Skopje out here, which doesn't look anymore like the modern white cube of the future. That doesn't look like that city that was developed in the 60s, but looks very different. So my body moves into this space, and I feel estranged from it. I feel, that it doesn't quite add up. That it's something that's a bit horrific in a certain way, because it doesn't match my modernist expectations. But in that horror, that moment of sort of realizing that I'm displaced from my position of centrality as a white European male, heterosexual, educated person, in that moment of despair, maybe in some senses, or horror in other senses, something else opens up. And the thing that opens up is, I think, the experience that we're all feeling. It's an experience of anxiety, it's an experience of nervousness, it's an experience of wanting to go back. It's an experience which produces the kind of politics that we have in the world today, this sense of displacement. Now, organizing or understanding that sense of displacement is, I think, one of the crucial tasks that the Modern Art Museum has today, and it's a very different task from the task it had in the past. Partly it's about people like me, through the experience of seeing that art, no longer being confirmed in our privilege, but coming to terms with our displacement, and coming to terms in a calm way with our displacement, coming to terms in a way where we don't want to destroy the world because we're feeling displaced, but but coming to terms with the fact that actually the world might open up and offer new possibilities, even for us, as we become part of the world rather than seeking to dominate it. And that goes back to a whole colonial history and back to Christopher Columbus, who was also a person like me, not coincidentally, by the way. And that history is something that we have to process in a different way now. And one of the ways to do that is to take these paintings, these modernist icons, if you like. I'm in an Orthodox country, so I can say that, and the people understand it. And modernist icons, and estrange ourselves from them, alienate ourselves from them. And in doing so, they become no longer these paintings that exist in the same space-time continuum as me, but they become a kind of archaeological object. You have a big museum of archaeology here. I mean, big, wide. It's not very thick, but it's wide. But you have this big museum of archaeology. And maybe that's the place where our modern collection would belong, far more than anywhere else at the moment. Actually, that could be the place where we could look at Picasso in a way that would be far more interesting and maybe far more significant than in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, for instance. Because that would estrange us, it would allow us to see a gap between ourselves and our own space-time continuum and that painting, with everything that it represents in terms of the privilege. And in a sense, they also become, and so we have techniques to learn this. So we have the Archaeology Museum, we also have the Social History Museum, we also have the phenomenon, in a certain sense, of a kind of cultural historical object. These paintings become cultural historical objects. They stop really being art in the way that we understand modern art. They are no longer art. They're something else. And that journey, that transition, which I'm very confident will happen. I mean, I think we can be very despairing about the world at some times, but also I think this transition is underway. There's nothing that can stop it. We cannot rescue modernism, and we cannot rescue modernity. It's gone. What we have to do is to figure out our relationship to it, because if we figure that relationship out in a bad way, then we'll lash out and we'll become angry and we'll become destructive because we see it slipping through our fingers. And we have to enjoy the feeling of it slipping through our fingers. We have to celebrate that. We have to see what emerges in our hands afterwards. And maybe the hands are empty, but at least you can see something else. You can see yourself in a certain way. And again, that we is that me, we. So that's, to some extent, that's where we are. And then maybe I'm talking too long, I think, now, but it gives you some idea of the approach. And then maybe I'll just show a little bit of an exhibition which you can also, to some extent, see in Pristina, actually. So I would recommend that you all go to Station and have a look at it, because you can see it there in 3 dimensions. And I know that Albert isn't going to talk about it, so I'll try and promote it for you. Okay, exactly, and it will also come here. So, some of you might recognize this as an Oda, as a Ottoman room. This is the start of the Banaba Museum's display of its collection. So it's no longer a white cube. It's an Oda. It's based to some extent on Kosovan models, because that's one of the origins of one of the curators here. A little bit enlarged. I know it's a big Oda, but it's a rich Pasha who was here. And behind you can see a little bit some images in the background. In a way, in these windows. What would traditionally, if you think about the traditional design of the Oda, this would be the windows out onto the street or into the fields or whatever. This Oda being the place sometimes often where guests were received. Also, this place where the light coming from behind was incredibly important, and you would sit there. Sometimes you would sleep there, things like that. So already this exhibition, which is called The Making of Modern Art, sort of sets up, much like the white cube sets up a certain kind of architectural relationship. This sets up an architectural relationship of difference, of us being inside, and somehow the story of modern art being outside. Now, I'm not going to tell you too much about this story, because you really have to come and see it, but just sufficiently to say that it starts in the Vatican in 1503, so not so long after our friend Columbus set sail for the New World, as he called it. And it starts in that moment with a pope Pope Julius II, who makes an extraordinary step, in a way, in telling a new narrative. Yeah? In a sense, and this is why he's the first modern pope, we could say, he makes an extraordinary step in that he says that these pagan idols, these sculptures, which are lying around Rome, sometimes underground, are actually things of aesthetic value. He's not saying that he wants to worship Apollo again, or worship Athena, or worship these gods. Yeah, he's not treating them as these pagan idols that, for most Christians, are nothing but evil. Yeah, nothing but evil incarnate, the opposition of everything that Christianity stands to. He's the leader of the Catholic Church at this point. Yeah? He's the leader of the Catholic Church in the center of the old pagan, heathen empire, the Roman Empire. But he's saying, no, let's forget about that. Let's say they have another kind of value. They have an aesthetic value. They're beautiful. Yeah, and I want to collect them. I want to gather them. And that's the start of the Vatican Museum. Yeah, the most important, perhaps the most inventive in certain ways for a long time museum in the world. And he brought them from Rome, and he brought them into the Belvedere in the Vatican, and he started displaying them. Now, what happens there? Yeah, I don't think he necessarily was conscious of this, but he does something extraordinary. He says that before Christianity, there was something of value. And there was something of value which Christians themselves can appreciate. And he says that there's an aesthetics which is in a certain sense above the divine. He doesn't literally say that, but he says that to some extent because he says these things are more important than as representations of these evil pagan gods. And in doing that, in a certain sense, he shifts the idea of time from a circle, in which the most important thing to know is what season it is, and whether you have to plant or you have to sow or you have to harvest or whatever. He moves it from that circular sense of time, yeah, which is a sort of also an internal Christian time, yeah, a time post the Messiah, a messianic time, if you like. Walter Benjamin would call it that. A messianic time where, because the Messiah had already been, then basically there was no more project, a kind of end of history, yeah? A sort of Fukuyama before. Jesus Christ is a kind of Fukuyama from 2,000 years before, in a certain sense. Yeah? He says, this is it. Fukuyama said liberal democracy was it. He wasn't very right. And Jesus Christ said, I'm it, in a certain sense. Yeah? Now, that process, that turning, becomes something which has a past and has a present. Now, you can guess pretty quickly that if it has a past and a present, and it's a line, and it goes from the past to the present, then it doesn't take a huge imagination to project it forward. Yeah? So if there was, simply put, a non-Christian world which had value, which wasn't just darkness until the moment that Jesus arrives, then there could also be a future which has value, but is no longer the world of Christianity. And it's no longer everything outside Christianity being dark and evil, but actually has something which we can appreciate. And from there, in a sense, the notion of any kind of secular truth, the notion of a possibility of improvement of the world, the notion of a future, and this city in the 1960s represented that future more than most. Yeah, that's where it comes from. No, that's the moment it's born. It takes a while for it to spread throughout the whole world, and the colonial powers have a lot to do with it, and they impose it in many places, and they get rid of these other circular times which exist in America and the whole of the Americas, or in Australia, or in parts of Asia with their occupations, and in Africa. They get rid of them for this straight line, this teleology it's called, yeah, this line in which things move forward in time and end up at some point in a conclusion. And so that's where this story starts. In a way, the making of modern art starts at this moment. But not only modern art starts at this moment, but also history starts at this moment. And the narrative, the story that our Julius II, our sort of heroic figure who invents us, invents the Van Abbe in a certain way, yeah? in a metaphorical sense, but sometimes almost in a literal sense. Yeah? He gives us permission to exist. That his action has these profound consequences, I think, for us, which are also interesting if you run a museum, because you realize there's actually quite a significant story at stake. Yeah? The alt-right often say that culture is upstream of politics. Yeah? They understand that the cultural actually then feeds into the political. And I think that museums, because they're playing with culture, are also upstream of politics. That some of our responsibilities are things that play out 10, 20, 30, 300 years later. But that this playing with the narratives that we have of these objects, just as Julius did, is actually part of our job as museum directors, I think, to try and establish. I wanted to show you this one, because this is maybe, when we say what would demodernize mean, in a certain sense, what would to demodernize the collection mean? It means to tell those stories that I've just told together with the Museum of American Art Berlin, and to try and understand and take distance from it. Yeah? It needs to create new narratives. And maybe one of the most important narratives, and I'm sure this will appear in the exhibition here as well, is this drawing. This is the cover of a book from 1936, and it's a drawing based on Alfred Barr's design for the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So Alfred Barr opens the museum in 1929. By 1936, he buys his first work. It's the first time it really becomes a museum in our European sense. Americans have a different sense, but in our sense, it starts to have a collection. And this exhibition is really absolutely fundamental to the post-war development of art and of museums of modern art. One of Alfred Barr's inventions, he's a kind of Julius II of the 20th century, in a certain sense. One of his inventions is that there should be museums of modern art at all. One of his great rivals was Alexander Dorner in Germany, in Hanover. And he wanted to tell a story of modern art which went from prehistory all the way through to what he called the Raum der Gegenwart, the room of the present, which was a room that was never built until we rebuilt it. Or till we rebuilt it without a copy. It's a copy without an original. But the idea was that the history of art could be told from the beginning to the end in a single institution. And what Alfred Barr said, no, modernism is different. Modernism is our time-space. Our, again, with that problematic notion of our, yeah? Our time-space, and it needs its own institution. It needs its own institution to be able to tell its own story. And his original proposal was that after 100 years, all the collections of the Museum of Modern Art would go to the Metropolitan Museum, which was down the road in New York, which was the museum that told the whole story, and that his museum would move through time. Now, around the 1970s, the trustees suddenly realized that they were going to have to give up an awful lot of their tourist attractions. Even in the 1970s, it was important, such as the Picassos and things. And so they said, maybe we're not going to give it to the Metropolitan Museum. And they renegotiated the contract, and it stayed in the Museum of Modern Art, which of course means that modernity around that time, you could argue, with that decision, modernism with that decision kind of stopped already in the 1970s. Yeah? It's a kind of mark of it having stopped, because now they wanted to tell a history rather than a present. But he wanted to tell a present, and one way he did this is he said, this is the story of the present. Now, I don't know if you can see it very closely, but this is maybe to most of you that have done art history a fairly familiar image and also a fairly familiar story. It starts with Impressionism and goes all the way through various things like Futurism and Cubism and Expressionism, and ends up with non-geometric abstract art and geometric abstract art. These are the two categories that he invented. That bit didn't carry very well, but the rest of it, these isms from constructivism and suprematism to style from our own country, have become the story of modern art. Now, what's interesting about this, because Alfred Barr was a very smart person, just like Julius II, and he realized that this story of modern art, while being an entirely European story, yeah, more or less you could say between New York, because he was in New York, otherwise it wouldn't be there, and Moscow, that was more or less the geography in which this was playing out. But at any time, this story was dependent upon something else, material, that wasn't part of the story, but influenced it. And he puts these little red boxes, and I don't know if you can see them there. It's a bit of a small image, but there are little red boxes here, which describe another relationship to the world than the diagrams. It's interesting, many other museums, certainly in Western Europe in the second part of the 20th century, would do similar diagrams, but no other diagram that I've ever seen has got these little red boxes in them. And what these little red boxes say, if you can't read them, I'll read them out. The top one is Japanese prints. Below that, Near Eastern art. to the right, Negro sculpture. I apologize if that's offensive to anybody, but it is what it says here. And the other one is machine aesthetic, which is very telling. Because what's in these boxes? Yeah? This is inert, dead material that inspires modernism. These are things which have no agency, which have no power in their own to be creative, to produce anything. They are the material on which modernism thrives. Now, it's not very difficult to go from there to notions of colonialism and to understand that Europe thrives on the inert material of the colonies. And our museum is an example of that, because we come from the tobacco fields of Java and Sumatra in the former Dutch colony of what is now called Indonesia. And that's where our money comes from as a museum. But he understood that, but he accommodates it in this way. And the demodern, I'm going to finish there. The demodern, as a gesture, maybe just to say, imagine that you're now, today, 2018. I teach quite a lot in the Netherlands. There's a very cosmopolitan artistic culture, many people coming from all over the world, including from Macedonia. And they learn at the Rijksakademie or the Jan van Eyck or these various places. So imagine if you're a sculptor from Cameroon and you look at this diagram and you say, where do I put myself in there? Yeah? Imagine if you're a Japanese printmaker. Where do you put yourself in here? Imagine if you're a conceptual artist from Lebanon. Where do you put yourself in here? The only place you have is the inert material. Yeah? Remember again that when we were talking about the influence of African sculpture, and to some extent also Southeast Asian sculpture, on Picasso and Braque when they were inventing Cubism, those works were contemporary works, made a few years before, sometimes only months before, and bought by traders, by collectors, and shipped to Paris and shown in the Trocadero. They were works that, if these kind of attitudes expressed in this map had been different, would have simply taken the collector to ask the person his name, and they wouldn't be anonymous, they'd have a name. He could go further and he could ask, why did you make it like this? He might have said, well, because you tourists keep on buying this stuff, so we want to make it. Or he might say, this is going back to some tradition from 2,000 years ago that we always make it, and it might have been a complete lie as well, because that would make it more expensive. So, we have to take account of these stories and to question them, but they didn't even ask the name, let alone why. They probably just took them, actually. A lot of anthropological material in museums, Tropenmuseum in Amsterdam, and the Musée de l'Homme, or Quai Branly in Paris, or the British Museum. All these questions of restitution now are returning to the idea that they were basically looted. So that process never happened, but it could have happened. They were contemporary works. The Japanese prints were contemporary, that were influencing Van Gogh. We had an exhibition recently in Van Gogh Museum about this relationship. The Japanese were not really allowed to speak. They were this inert material that had then determined what Van Gogh could paint. So we're still stuck a little bit in this thinking, if we think about the way that museums present their arguments. But the demodern, to finish, would be, and then maybe we can talk about some other projects later, would be simply to open these red lines up and imagine them running all over this map as one gesture. To demodernize this map would be to have a history of Negro sculpture of whatever kind, a history of Near Eastern art, a history of Japanese prints. And you could know, of course, that this is all inert material because you have machine aesthetic there, which gives you the clue that they're all dealt with in the same way. And this is of course, again, a human-produced thing. Machine aesthetic machines are produced, particularly in 1936, mostly by human labor. So they're still very much of a kind of similar quality, but you understand what these boxes represent because of that word. It gives you the clue to understand them. So this inert material, when it opens up, when it gets agency, suddenly needs to come into this map. And of course, when it comes into this map, or this plan, the whole plan is destroyed. Because it no longer leads to non-geometric abstract art and geometric abstract art. It leads to all sorts of other things, and it leads to all sorts of other conclusions, and it leads to all sorts of other relationships. And in a sense, the task, I think, of the modern museum now, if it's not going to tell the history, and go back to telling from prehistory all the way to today, is to try and use its collection to try and allow the Negro sculptor and the Lebanese artist and the Japanese printmaker to speak, just as much as Picasso and his followers. Thanks.
Yeah, let's hear the presentation of Albert, and then I'm going to give the floor for your comments and questions. So, Albert.
I'll leave the image as it is because we have the same work in Pristina. I was a bit shocked when you liked Skopje, when you saw it for the first time, because for us it is still, I mean, for me it is violence in a way. So it's violence. Perpetrated not only to the city, to a modern city, but also to citizens. Just to start with this. Another point in time when you were talking about the role of museums and the role of these objects, I mean, you could also reflect to these objects hanged in this museum and the role of this particular museum. It directly connects to the project that I wanted to talk about. So basically this project came out of an interest to question modernism, because in Pristina modernism means everything and nothing, you know. So I mean, Kosovo as a political reality somehow since the beginning, when it was inserted somehow in former Yugoslavia, developed parallel to the other realities, and traces of modernism are very often very weak, you know, like in terms of city architecture and urban planning, it meant erasing the majority of what the old city was, and it was mostly a mud brick city, so it's not that you could probably also preserve a lot, but the idea of a new life, new city, new man somehow created space for these interventions. And when you compare, I mean, I don't know if you can compare with what was happening here, what that idea was. The most precise comparison is when you said fake news, because this was the articulation of fake news in reality, you know, in real time. You know, basically fake news in real time looks like this. You know, I mean, today it has other, of course, moving objects all over the world, because we are living in this particular time. And I don't think it's isolated only to Skopje. Maybe Skopje it's an aggressive example, but you can find it all over the place. I mean, it's not isolated to our context. Our context is very specific because we come from a socialist reality, where you can call it either modernism or with any other name. City meant something for urban life and for education and for the right to public space, and I'm not going to mention the word democracy, but also collective idea of social and collective responsibility for not only the city but each other somehow. And out of this reality, a struggle for freedom and liberation is more possible than in other contexts. For instance, if you compare Kosovo with some other realities, more recently I was thinking, does communism and socialism have anything to do with what was happening here? So this is a very particular context. For us, the project was important because exactly what you were mentioning, these objects created a possibility for us to question a certain past and reinterpret, let's say, not only the objects but the time and the interpretations which were always given to us. So there were a number of artists which were projected as modernist artists in many ways, with some of them with significant influence in the younger generation of artists which were raised through the Academy of Arts. These were like teachers, academics, classics, but in their behavior of how they, let's say, taught or how they worked with the art scenes, they were anything but modernists. You know, so they were these heavy authoritarian figures which heavily claimed the ownership of everything around them. So no emancipation, very few space left for questioning ideas. In working with several of these artists, you could hardly speak about modernism. So these ideas were projected on their works more than they somehow projected these ideas on their works. But of course then there were examples. For instance, examples of works which had the power to show a particular time, which was not being shown otherwise. There's a work which I cannot show right now, but maybe I'll try to speak of a sculpture, Agim Chavdar Pasha. He was recently included in the selection for Documenta. So these sculptures which were a big leap in his practice. So he was living, normally he was living in Yugoslavia, and his sculptures were very soft, you know, very skin soft touches, usually working in marble, you know, like he would never leave a sharp edge. Whereas in 90s, his sculptures became very aggressive, you know. So he was basically using axes to create faces of women and similar, so not going into any other process where you refine your work and you are, you know, you have this sensitivity of touching the material and I don't know what. So he created this work which are faces of women which are taking part into a burial of a philosopher, Gani Bobi, very important thinker at that time in Kosovo, worked also as a cultural theorist, and most of the interpretations about the work were concentrated on the image of Gani Bobi, this person. Okay, so and it was enough, you know. So the work is called Women of Ljubenic. Ljubenic is the village, and I was thinking, okay, let's check the time. You know, when was this made? You know, what was happening at that particular time? So let's say it was 97 or 94 as an entry point. And then I said, okay, normally in Kosovo, women were not allowed to go in burials because there's a Muslim tradition. Women stay at home. Men carry the dead person, even if it's a woman, you know, to be buried. And I said, okay, maybe 90s not only lost or dismantled our system of values, but maybe they reintroduced something which was present there before. You know, it created this rupture. So all of a sudden, women were there. You know, because like how he shows women, there are these faces like this, basically, and then he drills these eyes with a drill. You know, so you have this, and they look at you like these very horrific sculptures, but no interpretation was talking about the women themselves, you know, why they are there, you know. So everyone was talking about, in the interpretation, about this huge male figure, you know, Gani Bobi. You know, I was like, let's talk about the women, you know, why were these women there, why they were staring like this, you know, what did they see in this work? So these objects, I don't necessarily agree with you that are dead and they can be placed in archaeological museums. I think these objects can still be reenacted, right? And because this is still our time. So this is not a time that we forgot or lost already, because other objects are objects that we are creating stories about them. And in these particular objects, this is still a space for us to think what we lost, what we still have, and what we can gain through analyzing these particular objects. And other projects, for instance, equally challenging because and it involved also collaborating with the National Gallery of Arts in Kosovo, because some of the objects are owned by the National Gallery of Arts, and we can talk also how they treat the collection and why the collection is treated as it is. And I think it's also very important to mention some of them were owned by a family collection, part of a family collection, like Agim Chavdar Pasha has a sort of a foundation which takes care of the object, doesn't do a very good job actually. I saw the exact same piece where it was exhibited in Documenta, because it's wood. The color of the wood had changed completely, because it's not maintained as it should. So there's also technique involved in how a museum piece should be preserved and how it should not preserve. So there's lack of complete knowledge and expertise in majority of these museums. How do you handle these works? And this is quite dramatic, because it lost the power. The work, when you check how it was exhibited in Documenta, and if you check images how it was shown at Station, it's not the same work anymore. Yeah, so it's very interesting. So this was one sculpture, and he was among very few sculptures which had a significant position. The other that we selected was Nusret Salia Medici, and also to explain how what was the approach through the texts that were produced. So basically, in each exhibition, the idea was to have a different narrative and a different approach. How do you address these objects? In the case of a painter, Nusret Salia Medici, another very important element appeared in the research. Basically, when a scene creates this master narrative, which is based on an idea of what a nation is and what a nation should be, at some point in time, this person, just because he was not completely Albanian, somehow he became less relevant than, let's say, Muslim Ulici. Today everyone talks about Muslim Ulici, but if you read books, catalogs produced early on during Yugoslavia, Muslim Ulici is not that important actually. So how he became important? He became more important during 90s. What were the 90s? The 90s were times when nationalism became, let's say, more potent as an element that can reconfigure completely the relevance of one art practice or the other, or the other. Another artist that was included in the research, because each element somehow tried to create a more complete picture of what were these developments. By mere chance, I discovered a painting in Brussels, visiting some friends, a painter that had left Kosovo in 70s, tried to come back again, left again. It's a very interesting story. Worked for some very interesting galleries in Brussels during 80s, which today don't exist. And through his story, and I want to read maybe this text in the end, you could really picture time, how it used to be, also in the art system and how it was moving, but also because he was working as, in a way, a designer in a printing company in Kosovo, and then he was working as a designer in a factory that was producing wallpapers. You could also discover a large economy that doesn't exist anymore in Kosovo. So there was, if you talk today about wall printing company, like wallpaper company, this is like, and then I was trying also to put some other elements, because this was our time at the same time. So there was an economy, there were workers, there were syndicates, so everything is more or less today erased. It doesn't exist. So for me, these objects and these traces are somehow revealing, or have the possibility of revealing, time and reality, which is somehow put in darkness. So darkness is not anymore ahead, right? It's also behind. In the end, in discussing with him, and this is a painter that worked for 30-40 years, I just saw one work that I could show, basically. So one single work. But maybe this was the only modernist that I talked to. And I explained to him, and I said, I think I want to show this piece. And it was a very interesting piece. He worked on it for 10 years. it's an auto-portrait, you know. It's like in the beginning of the work, his eyes are, but it's a great painting actually. But I hope I will be able to show it. So in the beginning and during some phases, he was taking pictures of his painting. You know, like he was painting, taking pictures, painting. So in the beginning, his eyes in the painting are open, and in the end, they are closed. But he never thought that he would show pictures, you know, like, because for him this was the painting, you know, this is the. And in the end, I decided, I said, can I just show a small photo, you know, because he was taking these very small pictures, but he was enjoying this process so much, and he was so happy that he was able to discuss with let's say someone that tries to understand his practice. And I could realize that he didn't work with a museum or a curator for maybe never. In the end, we just showed one picture, one painting. He came back. This was his first exhibition in Kosovo ever, basically, never invited before. Through the text, I was trying to reveal the economy, the political situation, developments that was happening at that time, also putting forward his biography, you know, like, I mean, it's a strange text a bit. There were two other painters that I was working with. One of them, Recep Feri, and this is this national, how you say, icon. He also writes. You know, this is even more dangerous. You know, I wanted to say, because his novels and his texts are really interesting. You know, like he had an interesting career. Yugoslavia back then, during 80s, had these cultural centers in Europe. Stayed at some time in Paris. You know, tried to make it there. It's super interesting for us to know. You know how, and then you would, because one thing that is important. So Picasso is not alive. These people are still alive. You know, so you can, for instance, Kader Pagarusha passed away just a few weeks ago. And with some of these people, probably we have last interviews or discussions or something that was still there. Recep Feri, he's probably the second biggest painter in Kosovo after Muslim Ulici. The collection of the National Gallery has many paintings of Recep Feri. It's like a lot of paintings. They all look similar. And in the end, you know, just like discussing, like, you know, I said, okay, if you would tell me where did everything start, because like it's a lot, you don't know what to pick and what to show. Can you like put your hand in one painting and say this is where this thing started? And he was very brave. He said yes. Like, great, you know. And he really selected a great painting. Like he selected this painting. Then we went to the National Gallery. At that time, the director of the National Gallery was a photographer. I think he showed also in Macedonia. Fahrudin Spahia, yeah, a photographer. Albanians probably know him more. So, and he was the person actually, because everyone credits Ezdan Shkololi for everything good that happened in the National Gallery. This person was working with the archive. So for the first time, you could lend works from the National Gallery through some procedures. You know, you had a catalog, you could select. So this was a guy who did this. And you could not smoke anymore in the National Gallery. There was heating. And heating is very important. You know, there's no heating here, people. And we wanted to have this painting from the collection. And it's a public collection. What is fantastic is then when you try to research, you understand that actually this collection was not created by the National Gallery. So this collection was created initially by an association of culture something, which was a public body which collected paintings, not only paintings but artworks. And then when the National Gallery was formed, and it was I think in 70s, something like that, yeah. So then they gave the right to the National Gallery to use it, but the National Gallery is not an owner actually, and they never say this, you know. And this is important. Like, it's a public ownership, so it's not only one institution. We realize that they cannot lend it to us. They cannot give it to us, basically, because the place where they keep the collection doesn't have any criteria, basically. So the work was damaged in the gallery. So if the gallery would give us the painting, we probably would say something about why it's damaged, you know, or they were afraid that we would say or something. So they said we cannot give it because it's damaged, you know. And this is like a national treasure. And how do you damage a painting? Because when you check how they store paintings, they're just like, I don't know. Then, okay, we were in this situation and we said, okay, what can we do? And I remembered Kate Moss, you know Kate Moss, when she was, I wanted to say indicted, when she was, she could not do the catwalk anymore because of this scandal, and then they did a hologram of Kate Moss, you know? And I said to Recep Feri, can we project your painting, you know? And he was, yes. I was like, great. So basically, in the end, what we did, we just asked for an image from the National Gallery. Can you send us a great image, you know? We had a great projector, you know, so we projected the painting. And then we were discussing also, where is the work right now? You know, like, where is the work, you know? Where is the... Why do they have this collection this way? Can we digitalize everything? Where's the object? Where's the... And one comment that I have to share with you, and he was also puzzled and thrilled, and he didn't know how to react to this, but very collaborative and very interesting. While we were discussing, and he's a member of the Academy of Arts, you know, this is, at some point in time, he said, maybe not many people will see this exhibition, you know, like he was he was hoping that this is not for real, you know. And it's for us, everything was an experience, you know, like one small comment, one big comment, and we were trying to puzzle a larger picture of how this society, how these artists are markers of some particular time. And this is still very, very valuable for us. The project altogether started not with this generation of artists. It started with Petit Halilaj. This was the first exhibition of Petit Halilaj in Kosovo. He's an artist originally from Runik, Skanderaj. This is Drenica region. Always wanted to be an artist, you know, like painted from when he was little. I mean, super talented as a drawer, like amazing, hard-working artist, you know, not... but, I mean, it was a bit also naive to play with this idea of the future, you know, and in a way also project a certain future. And this was totally not completely knowing the future, but it was in a way also accidental. But at that particular time when we were working on the exhibition, and the exhibition was also quite a complex operation, because I knew his practice from before and more or less had the idea what to show. The invitation came from the Berlin Biennial, curated by Catherine Romberg, for him to become part of the Berlin Biennial, which in many ways it placed him in this motion that is which is also something that he's still enjoying today. So he's probably most important young Kosovar artist today, or besides the personnel of the Museum of American Art in Berlin, he's the most important Kosovar artist, the second most important Kosovar artist internationally. The experience in working with him was interesting and challenging, because and just to share some social aspects of the work, which were also very important to highlight through the research and to document somehow. So through his practice and his work in Station, we were trying to document movement of, let's say, families, people from the village to the city, basically. So why are these people coming from these regions to live in the city? You know, when you go to this village, it's a magnificent village, you know, everything is beautiful. They have roads, they have water, everything. Yet, there's this idea that no, we have to go and live in Pristina, and in Pristina it's like this is the most polluted city in the world. Even statistically, these past 2-3 days, we were on top. This was like, and you don't understand this logic, like why these people are leaving their homes. And we try to document this through the practice of Petri Talilai. He did a work before in relation to his childhood, and he works a lot with his childhood. He works a lot with his family. Enters in areas of social relationships, family relationships, where very few artists can do in the way that he does. We decided to transport a sculpture which he did, which looks like a rocket, basically, like a tall sculpture, high sculpture for hens, for chicken, basically. So we were then documenting how, and symbolically, first we said, okay, if you want to move, let's move first the chicken, so that we test the site at least, how is this moving going to happen? Then we moved the chicken. We were taking care of the chicken for 2 months of the exhibition. And this was not the last part of the exhibition, this was the first part of the exhibition, of the whole project, basically. So Petri Talilai was the first part. And then in the end of the project, we invited Zdenka Badovinac. Zdenka runs probably the most important museum of contemporary art in former Yugoslavia, without any doubt, actually, not probably. And Shuchri Nimani, the director of the art gallery at that time. This was the name, the art gallery, today National Gallery of Kosovo, to discuss about the history of the gallery, that practice back then, and also to talk about the context today, where these institutions are today, and what is their role in current developments. Because currently we are faced with failures of these institutions to act as public institutions. So they are completely in service of political parties, not political, but in the service of political parties, which is different. And they fail to let's say, become what, and this is maybe something not to question, to become something that we would think that they were in the past. Because this is also not sure. This is not certain that these institutions used to function better before. Because I think what Moderna does in Ljubljana, I'm not sure if this was the same institution as it functioned before. And everything ended in a project which somehow gives space to another research and another project. And this is also a part of the difficulty that these independent institutions have in this region. They, even though a similar project or similar ideas in, let's say, museum context internationally, they would take 3 to 5 years to exploit and to understand and to work. So usually we scratch the surface, very often, and then we jump to another project. Whereas museums, which exist, they are fueled by public money. They don't do research. They are not interested to provide service for the public interest. And this is a reality which is very hard to question and challenge without projecting models. And this is what we try to do. Basically, we project models, what these institutions should be, and through creating models. And in these models, the idea of space is very important. This is something that we are working continuously. Space for these institutions today is more important than these museums, which are created for public institutions, because these museums are not public institutions as much as these other initiatives and institutions which are, let's say, created by the citizens. Let's say, because these institutions are created by the government presently. So it's not, yes, so it has a different, because we were trying to articulate also why we are, let's say, entitled to using public space. Because in Pristina, for instance, we use currently 2 public spaces. We don't have officially any contract with the city government or the Ministry of Culture for either of them since 4 or 5 years, and so it's not going to any let's say better future. So it's the reduction of public spaces is a process which is bigger than creating public spaces right now, and then we came to this understanding. Basically, let's understand that we are the citizens somehow, and we have our representatives in the parliaments, let's say. So, us, the citizens, delegate the right to representatives in the parliament to formulate or create the ideas of a public institution. In this case, we, the citizens, are taking the initiative and initiating the institutions ourselves. So, the discrimination should be so this model should be turned upside down currently, because like if you do a very basic research what these institutions do throughout the year, I mean there are also other countries which are stopping the funding for many public institutions and redirecting funding for independent institutions, and similar process is important also to happen in this context, because if an institution doesn't perform a public duty, and if it doesn't include, let's say, the public interest within its program, then public funding should not be granted. And this is something maybe not directly related to what you were talking, but I'm just trying to highlight also what is very important also for our context. Yeah.
If somebody has something to say, sorry, what? No. A question. Do you have? Okay. No.
I would like to address Albert regarding what you said at the end of your presentation. I'll paraphrase. You scratch the surface in a way to open the question, to open the problem, to discover the problem, and then, as far as I understood, so correct me if I'm wrong, and then the institutions are not continuing to dig deeper, or they are continuing deeper? If not, what do you think? Why is so? Because we have more or less here is the same situation. We have a massive, in a way, we have kind of NGOization of the public institutions. So the most important or interesting or provoking projects are coming from the field of the NGO, not from the programs of the institutions. Is it because of the crisis of the model of a modern art museum or not? I'm not sure. Is it the disinterested of the employees in the museum? I also don't know. But it's a vivid situation that regarding our Museum of Contemporary Art, which is contemporary art, Charles. Our museum is contemporary art, not modern art. That's the public image. So all the good things are organized, more or less, usually funded from other budgeted from other funds, and so it's this impression of NGOization of the public institutions. So how you understand, how you interpret this situation in Pristina, especially regarding your projects and your attitude or relationship with the national institutions or public institutions?
I mean, this. Can I reply?
Yeah. Maybe you can give the mic also.
I mean, not only in relation to the arts, but also other fields. There was always an attempt, and which we noticed also in Kosovo, if you want to dismiss an idea or a position, you dismiss the origin, where is it coming from. Basically, you have this dictionary also in the parliament. When there's criticism about an idea, they say, but it's an idea coming from the NGO sector, it's not relevant. The Islamic Association of Kosovo, it's an NGO. So by saying this, I want to claim that this is the biggest NGO in the country, basically, and they cannot say that to that association, right? Yeah, Islamska zajednica, it's registered as an NGO. So if you say that to the Islamic community of Kosovo, that would be a problem. If you say you are representing an NGOization of our society. What I want to highlight is that it is absolutely true, and it's not only in Macedonia. So it happens in Serbia, it happens in Croatia. Montenegro is even a more difficult case. Serbia, absolutely. I mean, Serbia is also the NGOs, the independent institutions which are registered to function as NGOs, because these are independent art and culture institutions. They are less and less with space to operate. There's an interesting situation in Croatia and in Slovenia, where, for instance, the independent institutions in Slovenia are so many that the Ministry of Culture, even if having the intent to support this structure, is becoming a burden for the public budget, which is because there are many, a lot of people work. But the reality is that these are the consequences of, let's say, of transition of these societies and our realities, where public institutions cannot perform as the only means of communicating through arts with the public, basically. So the decentralization, Kosovo is an interesting case, because during the occupation, during 90s, the Serbian authorities, they physically, in some cases, physically closed the public institutions. So workers of the National Gallery of Arts were not working anymore. The public institutions were ceased to exist. But then this created this other opportunity. This created the opportunity where these big names could exhibit very close to young artists in cafe galleries. So this equality created a different development in Kosovo, and it is different also from other countries, because we still don't have strong public institutions. But also it is also related to the capacity of these institutions. The National Gallery in Pristina still cannot issue a simple press release. It's even if they have Nicholas Hirschhorn showing there, they cannot issue a simple press release. Yes, Thomas Hirschhorn, sorry. So basically the capacity. And why? Because we were doing research on public policies and trying to understand also why. They are not evaluated. So the employment is not done according to some procedures, criteria. Who can become a director, who can become a curator, who can become an art historian, whatever. For instance, the current director of the National Gallery in Kosovo, basically they changed the statute in order for her to become a director. The statute before was you have to have 5 years of employment in leadership positions in arts and culture institutions in order to apply. She didn't have that. So basically they said, now the statute says you have to have 5 years of employment. So anyone can become a director, but not really, because this was done for one particular person. And what do you expect then from this institution? And no one really takes that institution seriously. That's why the interest of the public is where the work is, I mean, it's a big word to say real, but the interests are real. But then we are in a complex situation because of discrimination to accessing public space. For instance, this discussion normally should be organized in a space which is managed by an independent institution, and it should be a public space, and then heating would be there maybe. I mean, but no, I mean, it's not to criticize, because there are probably more complex issues why and how, but the idea, because there are also then these always these problems. For instance, this year, while we were organizing the program of Summer School is School, we had an idea to also use a public cinema, to show the film program there, and it was reopened. This was also a location where Goran Đorđević for the first time showed in his career. And everything went fine. Municipality appointed a person which looks like a good guy, as a manager. And more or less we can talk in the same way and listen to the same music and I don't know what. At some point in time, he became like an authority. And then we just received this email, the program cannot happen here. I was like, oh my God, what? And then the real struggle for having your independent space, which is not a space that you use temporarily based on some agreement or something, just was highlighted once again. Luckily, we operate another space. We just shifted the program there. It was fine. But what if we were a festival, right, which doesn't operate a space, and this person is the authority, and then how do you navigate your program around those people? And this is what's happening. So then these independent institutions have to navigate their program all the time, not to say something to that particular person, to that particular institution, to that particular political party. And these are the effects of the lack of autonomy of these public institutions. The National Gallery of Kosovo celebrates the day of Declaration of Independence of Kosovo with an exhibition always. So they don't have a program, So 17th of February, if I remember right, there has to be an exhibition. And in our research, it was like, okay, but this is not an institution anymore. This happened always, even when better directors were there or not. So this is then an instrument of power. So it's an instrument of projecting ideas, being that nation building, being that, but what about space for thought and thinking? What about creating possibilities that people can have other ideas? And these public institutions currently are not those spaces. And then we try to create these spaces, because it's also, in a way, the responsibility of few that have that, let's say, will or determination. But at the same time, we all the time try to question how other museums which function in other realities are using these spaces. What are these museums for today? Are they being questioned, rediscovered, refunctionalized for current conditions? How political and non-political they are. And this is where these collaborations are vital and important.
Okay, maybe I will start now from the end of Albert. Well, he kind of provoked me with this thinking about institutions. Actually, it's about what Nebojša is saying. Maybe to give a little bit context, I think that NGOization here, as Nebojša is saying, is something that it's related to anti-victimization, because NGO sector doesn't want to feel as a victim in the sphere, like actually where the culture and art happens. And why is this? Is because for many years NGO sector didn't have a spaces and started and tried to connect it, especially because the public sphere was decaying, and public sphere was the one that was hijacked by the political parties. So how we see, or how I see what is a public space or institution, I don't see it only as a state or a city institution. And I think that NGOization is actually trying to, how to say, to direct this thinking about the institution through the perspective that it's not to dispossession, you know, to dispossess it from the state or the city and give it to the others or to those to what the institution belongs. And therefore we think about the public space nowadays as spaces that are new institutional models where we actually are recreating the public sphere, because public sphere, to be discursive, to exist, needs a public space. Actually, to be political needs a public space. So therefore, I think that it's very positive that there is an institutional, or there is an NGOization of the institution. That's my perspective. And actually, probably it will follow up if we have a public will or if we have a political will with some kind of a new models of trying to think the institution itself or to institute new perspectives, values, or I would even say principles, how we think about what is institution. This is the first that I would like to start from, but I would like to go to the discussion that mostly tried to think, and this is related to the modernism. So I don't know if I understood well in this very dense presentation, which was full with, you know, many different, you know, theses or experiences or your starting points or departures. So first of all, I would like to ask you, actually in relation to what you said, that the modernism is actually something that it's related to the future that has to arrive. And as I understood, it's related also to go to the past and rethink about the past, the roots, as you said, and to rethink it out of this already established view in which the modernism has started, which is out of, on the outskirts or the margins or elsewhere. But what is the future for modernism? I didn't understood well, so I would like you to talk about it more. Is it the future of modernism actually in the contemporarity, in rethinking what is the contemporarity? And why I think on this is, I just got back, these are my Slovenian friends, and we just had this meeting in Museum of Modern Art in Ljubljana, actually, and I just bought this book of Claire Bishop, Radical, and Ivana told me, and Museology, and then I started reading it, and one of these things which started that I asked myself is about what is contemporarity, and it says there, and I'm just coming to read this part, because the rest I was reading it in a plane, and it says it's a discourse. So if it is a discourse, contemporarity, what is from, this is always related to the context in which discourse is produced, let's say. And in that sense, I would agree with Albert, who was saying that through this discourse, through this actually context to what I belong, I cannot displace myself from, or distance myself from the objects of the past, but I would like to reenact them, especially because here the modernism was revisioned, or was part of something that was a revisionism, for example. And this is the one thing. And the second thing is about what is then contemporarity for you, in a sense of institution of a museum, but not only Western museum, but in relation to these red quadrats, how do you say, squares. And I would like to ask you if you were ever thinking that this would be a mirrored object. For example, the red spots would be cubism and abstract art, and the rest would be filled by, for example, the context of Eastern history and stuff like that. So then what would be the contemporarity from this discourse? And another thing, what I like, what Albert says, was about this, let me see what I wrote, this object-it object, actually, what I liked, which was this hologram of this object. And what I think that this object-it object, actually the painting, not materialized, but transferred through our affects of the body, it's probably the contemporarity, how we see the relation towards the art nowadays, because my body, it's materializing the society in some sense, therefore it's affected. And have you ever thought about dispossessioning your possessions of the museum? Because it's about the possessions. And this museum do not possess a lot of things, and therefore it's an also very different kind of a departure.
Thanks. There was a lot in there, and I think partly you answered some of your own questions in the process of asking them as well, which maybe is interesting. I mean, when I was referring to the inert material, it wasn't that I was suggesting that the objects that we have are inert. I was talking about how this diagram is constructed. What I was saying about the objects was that we need to approach them as historical cultural artifacts rather than as objects that exist in a white cube, independent of their context. So I think when you start to think about reenactments, you're already acknowledging two things. One is that they need to be reenacted because they don't act in the present in the way that they were meant to act. So you're already recognizing a moment now which is different from the moment of their creation, because they require a reenactment. And I think that would be to shift them from an imminent object in the present to something which is close to a historical cultural artifact. So I think that we're not so different in this sense. So I think there's a difference between this idea of what's happening in these red boxes, and this also answers your question of whether this could be a negative, yeah? Because I think we need to move away from these kind of linear descriptions in total. Now, what is the contemporary, if we come to that? And maybe that's the other point. I hope that answers to some extent some of the first part. I mean, where I sort of draw my understanding of the contemporary from is more or less from the thinking around what's called decoloniality, which is related to this idea of the colonial matrix of power, and that would be to understand that we are all subject to certain forms of colonial thinking and colonial power relations. And those colonial power relations were determined by a certain part of Europe. And I think it's important also to understand that there are related and very similar kinds of colonialism that go on within Europe and go on outside of Europe, committed by certain parts of Europe. So the colonial occupations after the Ottoman Empire, for instance, here, by what were called the great powers, Austria-Hungary and France and Britain and things like that, are also lessons that were used to develop colonialism overseas, outside of Europe. There are many historical coincidences, but one is that the Conference of Berlin, which produced the division of the Balkans in 1878, was only 7 years before the Congress of Berlin, which produced the division of Africa. And so we can imagine actually exactly the same civil servants, the Beamten, would have been working on these two congresses, this conference and this congress at the same time. And there's almost exact parallels in how the discussions went and how the great powers, as they were called then, divided up these territories. I think that line still needs to be drawn, and another line that maybe would be drawn as in terms of our contemporary understanding, because I don't think those lines can be drawn so easily within a colonial matrix of power, which I would say is intimately connected to modernity. That in a sense modernity and coloniality cannot be separated. They're actually the same thing. They're not even two sides of the same corner. The modernity is what we, within the West, people like me particularly, would choose to call the good side, and coloniality would be the bad side. But essentially the one cannot exist without the other. There is no modern without colonial. And that's on a cultural level, as we can see in this diagram, as much as it is on an economic or a political level. So this separation doesn't exist, this separation that we try to create, and that's why both are born, in a sense, from Columbus's departure. And again, there are lots of historical coincidences about the end of the Moorish empires or Muslim empires, we can say, in the south of Spain, which could have had a quite similar relationship to Europe as the Balkans does in terms of religious mix, but was actually in the same year, 1492, the final Kingdom of Granada was ended. So there's coincidences in this sort of purification of Europe, as Western Europe particularly, in terms of its religious authority and colonialism. So all these things are very intimately connected, I think, and so you can't separate modernity and coloniality. So therefore, what is the contemporary? I suppose that the connection, I mean, one of the things that I think is very important for us to do from the point of view of the contemporary is not only to make this connection, so to make this connection, perhaps the most useful connection, which is a rather theatrical or dramatic one, is to understand the relationship between the Holocaust and colonialism. That's something that we failed to do in Western Europe after the Second World War, and it was a profound failure. So the idea of never again, which is something that, as we all know, we're losing, but nevertheless, the idea of never again was directed at a particular German policy between 1933 and 1945, and not at colonialism in general. But actually, the Holocaust is simply the return of colonial matrix of power to the lands of Europe. Now, I said that would be an understanding of a contemporary, which I don't think the modern could do. At least we didn't see it, except in very, very few cases, and mostly those cases were from the colonial world. So if the contemporary is in one sense, the contemporary is a writing of those histories which have not been written, and that's where I can probably align myself very much with Albert and maybe with you in terms of the capacities that those modern works have which are not released. But I would say they cannot be released within the paradigm that they are presented as modernist artworks. They cease, in a sense, to become modern in order for those potentials to be released. And I think that's what I'm interested in the contemporary moment, is to allow those things to be released. Now, one interesting aspect you mentioned is the body, and the body is also in denial in certain versions of modernism and modernist display. There are some very interesting drawings by Herbert Bayer, for instance, which depict the ideal viewer in the ideal exhibition. I could show you them if I were connected to the internet, where the head is replaced by an eye. And essentially, if you think about the white cube, it's this sort of disfiguring idea of ripping your eye out of your head and throwing it in the room. You're meant, in a sense, not to have your voice, you're not meant to have your taste, you're not meant to have any of the other senses available in that white room. It's a pure visuality, and this comes from modernist criticism in the 20th century, Clement Greenberg, Rosalind Krauss and people, who wanted to keep out the dirtiness of the world and allow the sort of purity of contemplation, of visual contemplation. Those kinds of ideologies, I think, are what the contemporary needs to defeat, but needs to understand that the fragments of those ideologies could still be rescued in a contemporary precisely through the idea of reenactment. So therefore, I think the white cube itself could become a reenactment within a museum, in which you understand the ideology of the white cube through its reenactment rather than through its immanent presence as a default forms of presentation. It becomes a theatricalization of that process in order to understand your own presence as a body and to tend to realize its inadequacies immediately. And because then the subject of the white cube becomes the issue rather than the subject of these paintings which are on the walls. And that then allows your body to start to speak, to allow its uncomfortableness, which we all feel, like the coldness in this room. We all feel that uncomfortableness within the white cube. I think we all experience that. The fact you can't speak, the fact that you can't often sit down. There are very often, it's a very Spartan, sort of, to some extent, Kabbalistic space. It has a relationship to certain kind of Protestant and Jewish thinking around space. That uncomfortableness of the space is actually something which we could address in its reenactment, which we can't address in its sort of default solution. So I think that the body becomes a very important aspect of the contemporary. I think the holistic becomes an important aspect of the contemporary, which is something that's very difficult for modernism and modernity to deal with, because it wants to separate all the time, to go deeper rather than to go horizontal, but to go vertical. And I think also what we need to think, and that's from decolonial theory is that there is no universalism that is not built by sheer hard work from the very roots of our common human experience. In other words, there's no universalism which can be assumed at any point. It has to be built through experience, and that experience is almost individualized. And what that means is that all we're dealing with, I think, within the contemporary is a set of different kinds of options which maybe lie alongside each other, and none of them are right. None of them are good. None of them have these sort of ethical judgments that we can place on them to say this is better than that. But the existence of the options themselves is what we need to preserve. And that I think those would be the approaches to what might become a contemporary way of thinking outside of the colonial matrix of power, while always recognizing that colonial matrix of power itself. And we can look at the history of the last 20 years as a history of the refusal to embrace options other than the neoliberal across the world. And the neoliberal is also the reason that state institutions don't work anymore, because the state is meant in this sort of communist ideology, in a sense adopts it and says the state has to wither. And so the withering of the state did not happen under communism, but happened under neoliberalism. And then public institutions wither with the withering of the state.
But the question is, did it happen earlier? So yes, these institutions are not functioning right now, but are we projecting an idea that it was better before with these exact same institutions, right? And how do we find out? How do we trace this this timeline? So you said modernism and colonialism, and it's very interesting because when the first attacks on modernist architecture started in Kosovo, politicians were the first one who said, well, you have to know where did this architecture come from. And they were implying that it came with the Yugoslavs, with the Serbs. So they were a direct result of colonialism, let's say. But we don't agree, so we don't necessarily agree. So, or we thought that this is a language only to justify corruption, let's say, to justify demolition of modernist buildings. So this is a language that is part of populist ideology to alienate people from being connected to these buildings. And these buildings building cities, modernism as an idea, and they are resemblant. That's why I asked, what is the connection? And this actually happened in front of my eyes. I was in a panel discussing about a building, and there was a deputy prime minister who uttered, basically, he said this word, but you have to remember where these other buildings are coming from. So we just have to erase them, to erase this existence. At the same time, when you talk about rediscovery or reenactment always bears the function of today, right? So reenacting always should or includes elements of the present context, right? They rarely can be reenacted if it doesn't. And also reenacting or reinterpreting maybe white spaces, you made me think about relational aesthetics as well. Because if you read Bourdieu, he says sociability, let's say possibility for us to create a community, a society, and a larger, because there are also theses that say, Boris Budin says we underestimate the fall of the Berlin Wall and socialism, and we think that this only dramatically changed political systems. He said this meant the end of society as such, basically, and it is dramatic reading, but you can associate yourself maybe, or what happens with that. But what I wanted to say, Bourdieu in relational aesthetics, and it's true, you cannot speak with a loud voice when you go and visit exhibitions, but you can speak. So you can talk to one another when you are looking at Picasso, right? So you can say, but he says if you go to a theater play, you cannot speak. If you, yes, well, but So if you go to see a concert, you cannot speak, so you cannot create a community. He says in exhibitions around artworks, you can create communities. I mean, to oversimplify it, but these readings, these different readings, maybe add to this idea of what contemporary is today in relation to these spaces and what these spaces are. When you say that we have to have multiple options, you are clearly talking about the democracy as an idea, right? The democracy is an idea, but again, when you insert democracy in art, that's also a very dangerous, very, not to call it dangerous, but very questionable notion, because in the end of the day, from our understanding of developments around us, whenever they cannot push an idea, they say, okay, let's vote. You know, so the minority versus the majority, yes, no, but I'm just like inspired from what you were saying. So democracy, sometimes, you know, I remember we were together in a meeting with Ivana, and we were talking with a network of organizations doing more or less the same award for young artists. And whenever they didn't have any argument for the agreement, they were saying, let's vote. And I said, no, we will not vote, you know. There's no vote, you know, let's talk, you know. This is the standard way of how to silence a minority, how to marginalize a position. It's like, let's turn to democracy. You know, no, let's talk, you know, let's redefine our positions, or question at least our positions. Yeah, just maybe not related to.
Just to defend the idea of sort of the decolonial options, because I think that should be defended in the face of that. Democracy is seeking consensus, and it's seeking a single decision. So this is the difference between an idea in which a set of options will be laid out without necessarily choosing between them. And it's not the choice that's made. The choice can be made by one community in one set of circumstances, and then by another community in another one. And often the decolonial as an option is put alongside things like re-westernization or de-westernization according to Chinese models, even a spiritual model which has been constructed, which also allows these sort of quite major models to exist alongside each other, and not to seek this consensus which democracy is meant to build. So it's an anti-consensual move to think about options. So I'd want to defend the decolonial from the accusation of a kind of a democratic or a social democratic, perhaps, sort of failure a failure to address real conflict, yeah, an attempt to hide conflict, and therefore to produce it later in a far harsher form.
Sorry, I would like to connect to Albert's example of how Albanians try to destroy the brutalist or modernist buildings as an example of Yugoslav colonialism. But and also I would refer to Charles to his definition of and connection between modernism and colonialism. For one thing that I learned when I studied in Italy is that they have a quite different definition of modernism than the rest of Europe. They define modernism since the Renaissance, since when we switched from believing that making pleasure to God and He will return to us with good, into switching the example of the Pope to, if we continue to study sciences like the Greeks did, we will create a better future for us. So that's the Italian definition of it. And then the definition general of modernism is that after the Industrial Revolution, when this idea of using science or technology later for improving human life spread all around Europe, and of course with the biggest example of the English after the arts and crafts movement and the start of the colonialism, English colonialism. Of course, the colonialism started not in the period nor after the industrialization or the finding of America or Marco Polo in India, but maybe even of Alexander the Great, who colonized all the known world. So I don't see relation between, yes, of course they generally what is known as modernist period from industrial revolution to today, and colonialism and the rise of global colonialism, they coexist, but of course they are not they are naturally correlated.
Can I mean, just quickly to come back on that, I think that what we understand as the colonial matrix of power is an economic model. And so therefore there was slavery before this transatlantic slave trade, but slavery had different kinds of meaning. Very rarely was the economic the imperative. It was often about conquest and about ensuring control. The Ottoman Empire actually was never really an economic empire, and that's why it failed. The empires that turned colonialism into an economic project, and through that economic project into a power project, were actually those that existed after Columbus. So I think we can say that Alexander the Great was a colonialist, and I don't want to disagree with you for a moment, especially standing here, but I think there were the colonial matrix of power, the colonialism that we're talking about, has a specific economic exploitation at its root, and if we can't find that economic exploitation as the number one priority of the colonial adventure, and that's why the Dutch will call it a trading empire, because they saw their colonialism in terms of trade. They didn't see it in terms of conquest. So, and that's different from, for instance, Alexander the Great. So that the relation between the modern and the colonial is through the economic, and of course ultimately through capital. And so capital is what we're talking about in a sense as being the connection between these two.
And regarding to the destruction, like the local destruction of brutalist buildings, both by Kosovars and both by nationalists in Macedonia with the project 2014, of course, we have this really strange problem in education in the Balkans, that we study literature in elementary school at about 10 years of age, and we learn all the definition of literature and all the metaphors and all the how it functions, and that's done also the same for music lectures, but in visual arts it's complete silence. You just draw. So 99% of the public things craft, the physical production of artwork, is the definition of art, and not the whole process which generates before that and the message that carries. So that's why governments or our politicians could lie that this copy 2014 to the general public is an art project. Instead, it was a criminal project, or in this case in Kosovo, brutalist is a socialist architecture, which is not. Of course, we know that all the modern architect, what we defined today as modern architecture, was started with Bauhaus in Germany in a certain context when they had to rationalize and they had to eliminate all the decoration. And of course, that context which Germany had between the wars became a global context. The whole world was destroyed after Second World War, and everybody had to eliminate decoration and accept what was previously thought very ugly architecture, the modern and rectangular no decoration architecture that later became the international style. Now, because it came into the Balkans with the communism, generally because people are not educated, they think, okay, this is communist architecture, and that's why also here this government try to erase or refacade most of the modernist architecture, but symbolically they were erasing all the symbols of progress. All modernist architecture has this symbol. It looks like a machine, and it has to has the idea of progressive future where we use machines to better our lives. And that was, of course, what modern architecture, the real name of modern architecture, is called the international style, which it's an art style that it's global and not national like they were before. And of course, that is a problem. An international style is a problem for nationalists. They want to have their national identity. So that's why all the brutalist or modernist buildings in Skopje were erased. They don't want to be European, they want to be Macedonian. Of course, and I can relate to that with the newest, like one of what Zizek said several days ago about we have to eliminate the whole idea of nation today if we want to survive with this kind of capitalism which completely destroyed already our planet. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, like me, at the end.
Say one thing. It's not the Kosovars or the Macedonians. I would group them depoliticians. You know, it's more fair. You know, because it's not that the Kosovars are going against. Because actually, citizens try to protect these buildings. It's depoliticians, and it's a special breed. I wanted to say it's like, and we share these politicians.
Okay.
Cross.
It's always like comes down to that.
But there's a criminal aspect, no, which you talked about, and I think some of these are decorative excuses rather than substantial connections between colonialism and modernism.
But it's changing a system of values. So the communism is like egalitarian and also international system of values, and what the nationalists do are changing a system of values where national is important and international is not important.
Okay, I wanna actually thank you, Charles, thank you, Albert, for this discussion and for presenting your works. And then maybe because I didn't have a chance to talk about maybe the concept of decolonization in the concept of the colonialism and modernity, but I'm just gonna announce this topic for next year's discussion. So thank you again for being here, and hope we're gonna see each other again soon. Thank you.
Space.
Not with us.